Hello there. Today we're going to talk about the publishing process to help you differentiate between different types of materials that you may find for your research projects. There's a fair bit to cover, so let's dive in. I have two goals for today's discussion. First, I'd like to demonstrate why your professors usually insist that you use peer-reviewed sources by explaining what that is and which types of resources that applies to. I have a feeling that you'll understand and appreciate the difference in credibility that the peer review process brings after our talk today. My second goal, however, is to reassure you that the publishing process is accessible to you. If you decided to set a goal for yourself of writing and publishing a journal article while you were a student here, that's something that can be within reach and will feel much more doable after you understand the process that I'm about to outline today. Okay, so the big question, how does it get published? First, we need to talk about what kind of it we have in mind. There are really two different pathways to publication that we're going to talk about today, the academic publishing route and the popular publishing route. There are a couple different types of materials that fall into both of those pathways, the popular pathway including things like newspaper and magazine articles, along with blogs and YouTube videos. The academic pathway includes things like journal articles, master's theses, doctoral dissertations, and scholarly books. The popular pathway is written for the general public, and the academic pathway is written for specialists. In the academic publishing route, the process begins when a researcher comes up with a new idea. We usually think of this in terms of a grand new discovery, like a new element or a new species of dinosaur, but just as often the new idea is a flaw in another scholar's argument. It's useful to remember that academic scholarship is an ongoing conversation between experts in a field of study. That's why a new idea doesn't need to be this massive, groundbreaking discovery, but can instead be a smaller contribution to an ongoing conversation. Once a scholar has come up with their own contribution, they next need to write down their idea. This is where the research comes in. After the scholar has gathered their ideas together, mustered an army of sources, and written out their thoughts into a paper, they send the finished product on to an editor at an academic journal. Journals usually specialize in a small range of topics, so the first step will be for the journal to assign a specific editor who works on that topic to the paper. If the journal doesn't have an editor who works in that topic, then the journal isn't a good fit for the scholar's paper, and the process ends right there. If the journal is a good fit, then the editor will assign the paper to two experts who work in the same field as the scholar. The scholar's name is erased from their work before being distributed, so the experts don't know whose work they're reading. This ensures that the experts aren't biased for or against that scholar. Next, the expert peer reviewers will evaluate the scholar's work. They're not checking to see if they agree with the scholar's arguments. Instead, they're looking to see if the scholar has used appropriate sources and made a good argument. They might also suggest sources that the scholar hadn't included and may not have considered. The peer reviewers weigh in on whether the scholar's argument is new and worthwhile to publish. One of two things happens next. The paper is rejected by the peer reviewers, in which case the scholar goes back to the drawing board, or the peer reviewers recommend that the paper be published. If the paper was accepted, the scholar now probably has some small revisions to do before the paper can actually see the public and be published. These are usually small stylistic or grammatical changes, but could include things like adding source work or considering other ideas in different places. Major changes would require another peer review process, so if a paper is good but not quite publication ready, it might go through this process more than once, this peer review process. Once the scholar has completed the recommended changes, they will submit the final draft to the editor. The paper has now become a published journal article. Hooray! Publishing a journal article is a long process that requires lots of research. Our scholar wanted to be sure that they had found every bit of information on their topic to make sure that no one else had already done the same project that our scholar was working on and come up with similar arguments. The peer review process usually takes a few months because experts are busy people, and it would not be uncommon for a few semesters to have passed between the initial submission of the scholar's work and the actual publication of their article. That's the academic publishing route in a nutshell. The process is basically identical when we think about scholarly books, keeping in mind that the process is probably quite a bit slower because books are so much longer than journal articles, and very similar for master's theses and doctoral dissertations. The main difference there is that the master's student and the doctoral student know the people who are their peer reviewers. Their peer reviewers are instead a panel of professors who are experts in the field and will guide the student in the publication process. So how is the popular publishing route different? Let's talk about the process first. A newspaper article begins when a reporter gathers information, usually firsthand through observation or interview. This distinction is partially one of primary source versus secondary source. Newspaper articles are mostly working from first-hand primary sources, while scholarly academic work can include primary sources, but usually includes secondary sources as well. The reporter then compiles their notes and observations into a written article of a standard length before submitting the article to their editor. The editor and reporter go back and forth on any necessary revisions or changes for stylistic considerations, clarity, and length requirements to fit the newspaper layout. Once approved by the editor, the reporter's writing then becomes a newspaper article for the next edition of the newspaper. A newspaper article written by a professional reporter will typically undergo this entire process in a single business day. That covers newspaper articles. What about magazine articles? Here, the process is mostly the same with one key difference. It's easy enough for guest writers to submit writing to a magazine for publication. Therefore, they're not professional full-time staff in the same way that newspaper reporters are, even though they're usually experts in the thing that they're writing about. These guest writers are paid a premium per word for their work, and the publication process is usually a little slower, taking place over a few weeks or months rather than a single business day. Magazine articles are still written for the general public, but might contain articles written by specialists for a general audience, and don't undergo the peer review process. Lastly, there are born digital materials like YouTube videos and blogs. The publishing process for this category of content is even more streamlined than the articles we just discussed, removing the editor from the equation entirely and allowing the content creator to directly upload materials for public consumption. Because there are no checks and balances on the materials, blogs, and YouTube videos, and other born digital published materials are much harder to assess for reliability and credibility. So why are there two different publishing routes anyway? Think about who reads each type of resource that we've just talked about. Journal articles and academic books are written by academics and mostly for other academics or academics in training like you. They engage in that scholarly conversation that I mentioned earlier, with scholars trying to persuade one another with new ideas and new spins on old ideas. In a way, a journal article or an academic book is designed like a court case. You gather all of your evidence and argue the case, hoping that other scholars will agree with you and be persuaded. You show your work in the citations on each page of your writing so that other scholars know where your information came from and can decide for themselves whether that information is trustworthy, and by extension whether your argument is strong or not. Newspaper and magazine articles, on the other hand, are written both to inform the general public and to sell copies. Style is almost as important as content, which is why the role of the editor is so much greater and the peer review process is absent. There's also usually a need to publish faster and connect to current events. The peer review process is just too slow for that. The general public is also much less interested in reading long passages in foreign languages, like Greek, for instance, that you might find in a journal article about Greek history, and will instead trust that the author knows what they're talking about. The same usually goes for sources and in-text citations. These are crucial for scholars who want to decide whether the evidence used in a journal article is trustworthy, but aren't as important to the general public in a magazine or a newspaper article. It's important to remember that writing journal articles and other academic writing is often something that scholars do on the side, beyond the responsibilities of their day jobs as academics and professors. Academic journals do not pay for content, so the author of an academic journal article spent considerable amounts of time to put together a piece of writing that will be added to their resume but will otherwise not benefit them in any financial way. Magazine articles, on the other hand, usually pay a premium per word, and writing articles for a newspaper can be a full-time career. And that's it. You now have a much better sense of how different resources are published, and hopefully feel confident enough to work up towards a journal article of your own. Feel free to browse the other videos in our collection to improve your research skills even more.